Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Rural Inequalities, Evaluating Approaches to Overcome Disparities, an international conference organized by the Independent Office of Evaluation of the International Fund for Agricultural Development, or IFAD. My name is Joanne Leviton from IFAD, and I'm delighted to be the master of ceremony for the event today. Growing inequalities are one of the greatest threats to poverty reduction, economic growth, and social cohesion. This is recognized in the 2030 Agenda commitment to leave no one behind by eradicating poverty in all its forms and dimensions, combating inequality, and fostering social inclusion. Realizing this vision requires reaching the last mile of the poorest and most vulnerable people living in remote rural areas. So over the next 2 days, we will identify effective approaches to overcoming disparities in rural areas and the means for evaluating them. We'll also examine how evaluations can contribute to reducing inequality in rural areas and draw lessons for designing policies and projects. As you will all have seen in your program, this conference has a mix of plenary sessions and a number of breakout groups. It's organized along 4 main areas of inequality, the 4 R's: resources, resilience, relationships, and rights. So in relation to these 4 areas, over the next 2 days, we're going to address 4 key questions. What resources need to be redistributed? To what extent and how? How can risks be redistributed to strengthen the resilience and eliminate the double punishment of the most vulnerable? How can relationships be rebalanced so that those left behind count, are recognized, and have a voice? And how can policies, laws, and rights serve as a remedy and a means of institutionalizing equality? So over the next 2 days, we're bringing together experts from the UN, government, the private sector, civil society, and we hope to find answers to these questions and a way forward to reduce inequalities in rural areas. So before we start, I would also just like to welcome our virtual audience who are following via webcast and on social media through the hashtag #EvalInequalities. I encourage you all also to extend the conversation beyond these walls by tweeting and posting your stories on social media. Our evaluation colleagues will be sharing sound bites and snippets on Twitter with on the handle IFAD. So now we have a really full day ahead, and so let's get started. And I'd like to invite Oscar Garcia, the Director of the Independent Office of Evaluation, to give the opening address. Please come up.
Ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to the International Fund for Agricultural Development, IFAD. It is a great pleasure for me and my team at the Independent Office of Evaluation to have you with us over the next 2 days for this international conference on rural inequalities. Many of you have traveled long distances to share your experiences and expertise. I want to thank you all for your contribution to this collective effort. In particular, I would like to acknowledge the presence of His Excellency Eko Putro Sanjojo, Minister for Village Transmigration and Disadvantaged Areas in the Republic of Indonesia, a country where fighting inequality was recently made the top priority of the current administration. I would also like to acknowledge the presence of Professor Martin Ravalion from Georgetown University and former director of the World Bank's Research Department. It is an honor to have you both among us, and I look forward to the upcoming plenary address on what is needed to reduce rural inequalities and how can we measure its achievement. Among us is also Professor Giovanni Andrea Cornea from University of Florence, who will address the plenary tomorrow with a speech on can a historical, plausible reduction of inequality eradicate rural poverty by 2030? And Dr. Uni Karunakara, President of Médecins Sans Frontières and Assistant Professor at Yale School of Public Health, who will speak on how can we reduce rural inequalities, what actions are needed. Finally, I am delighted to have with us Cornelia Richter, IFAD's Vice President and former Managing Director of GIZ, representing IFAD Senior Management, with whom we have extensively collaborated in organizing this conference. Besides her is also Paul Winters, Associate Vice President for Knowledge Department in IFAD, who has been a key pillar in the preparation of this conference. Ladies and gentlemen, the 2030 Sustainable Development Agenda offers the world a guidance that tackles head-on the challenges of increasing inequality and aims to not leave anyone behind, neither women, children, youths, indigenous peoples, or other minorities. It presents a call for action and a call for transformative change. Transforming the rural sector is essential to achieve the SDGs. The report on the state of food security and nutrition in the world, released in late 2017, had a disturbing message. After several years of decline, hunger is now on the rise. The estimated number of chronically undernourished people in the world increased from 777 million in 2015 to 815 million in 2016. The reason for this rise in hunger are largely due to the proliferation of violent conflict and climate change-related shocks. In all regions, rates of extreme poverty and food insecurity are higher in rural areas, where 3/4 of the extremely poor and food insecure people live. Agricultural growth has been widely recognized as a precondition for a country's economic structural transformation and a powerful vehicle for poverty reduction. But as many countries begin to shift from agriculture to industry and services, what is happening to the poorest people, rural people who primarily depend on agricultural livelihoods, in particular to the small farmers who are not part of local or global value chains? In many countries, inequalities within the rural areas are worsening despite high economic growth. This calls for a need to better understand the relationship between inequality and rural poverty reduction. Despite many improvements over the last decades, the people excluded from these gains are found in increasingly predictable locations. They are individuals who belong to groups that are discriminated against and excluded within their own societies. This discrimination may be on grounds of religion, ethnicity, gender, and/or disability. Consequently, for the world's poorest to survive and thrive requires removing the inequalities that bind them, without addressing systemic constraints that the benefits of economic growth will be captured by those who are already rich. In the words of the former German Chancellor Adenauer, we all live under the same sky, but we don't all have the same horizons. Development programs may be improved by using technology, improving service delivery, achieving higher agricultural yields, or better cold supply chains to distribute vaccines. But without transforming the binding constraints that reinforce the deep-seated causes of chronic poverty, substantial progress is unlikely. In turn, reducing inequalities requires achieving change in the systems or underlying causes of impoverishment. IFAD is committed to promoting more inclusive and sustainable rural transformation as the means of achieving its mandate to eradicate rural poverty in developing countries. A primary question for IFAD is how to target the poor and vulnerable through its poverty reduction interventions. In light of IFAD's targeting policies and strategies and the vast literature already existing on urban-rural equality, we will in the next 2 days focus on inequalities within rural communities. For that purpose, the conference we have categorized these structural inequalities in terms of resources, resilience, relationships, and rights. Ladies and gentlemen, what does this mean for the way we conduct evaluations? Firstly, evaluators will need to ask the right questions. This means changing the conversation and focusing on the structural issues of inequality, be it economic, political, or social. Why is that tens of millions of people are without fresh water? Why is that tens of millions are without food or political voice? The realities go far deeper than just being poor. But up until now, few evaluations have tackled the issue on inequality head-on. Traditional approaches in evaluation typically apply a linear thinking to development projects, as reflected, for example, by log frames, and do not address the political economy of its interventions. So while poverty is traditionally understood as an individual or household level phenomenon, inequality, by contrast, shifts the causal analysis to social structures and relationships. With the introduction of the SDGs, the interconnectedness of different sectors and the complexity of the development process are being recognized. Advocates of a more progressive evaluation model speak of evaluation being morally engaged, value-driven, with an emphasis on results in terms of social justice and democratic process. Evaluation can make a contribution to reducing poverty and inequality by improving the analytical framework. But to do so, evaluation community will need to examine the process and consequences of inequality more carefully and thoroughly. The world is converging around high levels of inequality, and they matter. As we know, inequalities are multidimensional, multi-layered, and cumulative. Understanding and acting actively upon inequalities requires looking beyond income disparities to capture their political, environmental, social, cultural, and knowledge dimensions. Untangling such complexities is a challenge we must act on. Countering inequalities also requires robust evidence and more disaggregated data. At the heart of this conference is a call for a revitalized development agenda on inequality, one that is global in its outlook and local in its consequences, and draws from across the disciplines. Hence, we have at this conference people coming from diverse disciplines, institutions, and countries. The richness of this conference is reflected in the diversity of its participants, and I believe will stimulate innovative thinking. I encourage you to be provocative, but also to listen and to be open-minded. Speaking across disciplines is easier said than done. Whether you are a development practitioner, a government leader, a researcher, an activist, or working for the private sector, my hope is that this conference will inform your decisions and inspire you to make your actions count. Thank you for your being with us today, and enjoy the conference.
Thank you, Oscar, for laying out those challenges for all of us. I'd like to now call on IFAD's Vice President, Cornelia Richter, to give her opening address. Thank you.
On the need to better understand the relationship between inequality and rural poverty, and for explaining so clearly the important role of evaluation and in reducing poverty and inequality. Excellency, distinguished speakers, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, I'm particularly grateful to Oscar and his team for organizing this conference on rural inequalities. According to the World Inequality Report, income inequality has increased in almost every region of the world since the 1980s. Here in Europe, the wealthiest 10% hold 37% of all national income. Globally, this is a fairly modest proportion. In the US and Canada, the top 10% hold 47%. In sub-Saharan Africa, 54% of all income is in their hands, and in the Middle East it is 61%. It is true that as the world becomes richer, the world's poorest citizens are also benefiting. Poverty rates are falling. In 2013, the latest year for which we have figures, the number of people living in extreme poverty stood below 783 million, or about 10.9% of the population. Just 5 years earlier, there were 1.22 billion extremely poor people, accounting for 17% of the then global population. However, while fewer people than ever are living on 1 $0.9 a day, it is also true that the share of growth reaching the hands of the richest 1% is double the amount reaching the bottom 50%. And as countries get richer, inequality within countries is also rising. Meanwhile, about 60% of African so-called middle class remain barely out of the poor category. They've been called a floating class, who have earnings of between $2 and $4 a day. They may have excited extreme poverty as statistically defined, but we have to ask ourselves whether development is really succeeding if so many are still living precariously. Thanks largely to the popularity of the book Capital in the 21st Century by Thomas Piketty in 2014, issues of inequality are very much part of the public discourse, sparking many animated discussions. There are arguments, and we may hear them over the course of this conference, that a certain degree of inequality is desirable. Some studies indicate that a degree of inequality can create incentives for innovation and business entrepreneurships. But as Piketty and colleagues note in the 2018 World Inequality Report, and I quote, "No single scientific truth exists about the ideal level of inequality, let alone the most socially desirable mix of policies and institutions to achieve this level. Too stark a divide between the haves and have-nots within a society is detrimental for everyone. According to the International Monetary Fund, income inequality lowers social cohesion and increases political polarization, and this in turn can reduce economic growth. A new report by the McKinsey Global Institute estimates that increasing gender equality in the Asia-Pacific region could increase annual gross domestic product by 12%, or $4.5 trillion by $2,000 by 2025. This figure also highlights a sad truth. In a world of inequality, some people are more unequal than others. Across the globe, across cultures, and across socioeconomic divides, women face greater barriers than men. The World Economic Forum estimates it will take 100 years to close the gender pay gap. Issues of inequality are magnified in rural areas. We tend to think of poverty in terms of city slums, but globally, 80% of the world's poorest people live in rural, not urban areas. And most of the world's poor adults work in agriculture. Even here, gender disparities mean that more women than men are left behind. It is estimated that simply giving women the same access to resources as men would result in a 20 to 30% increase in their farm yields, reducing the number of hungry people in the world by 12 to 17%. Of course, the impact of inequality extends beyond income and farm yields. On virtually every development indicator, rural women fare worse than rural men and worse than urban women. Other groups that too often get left behind include the young, the old, indigenous people, and the disabled. Like rural women, they have less access to finance, to land, and other essential resources and services. And they are more likely to be marginalized with no political voice and limited engagement in their society. This is the context in which we are meeting to discuss rural inequalities. Clearly, there is a pressing need to build on our knowledge of what already works, as well as explore new and innovative approaches to development that reduces disparities. Over the course of this conference, we will be hearing from an impressive array of experts, so I will not presume to lecture you. What I will say is that IFAD and its partners share a deep and abiding commitment to eliminating poverty and hunger and ensuring the Sustainable Development Goals are met. And we know from 40 years of experience on the ground that the only way to truly eliminate poverty and hunger is to address the root causes. And one of the central causes is inequality in all its facets. We are also aware that addressing inequality requires involvement from the private as well as the public sector. As part of our approach to inclusive development, IFAD pioneered what we call the 4 Ps approach, public-private producer partnerships, because the traditional 3 Ps inured the producer, and producers are essential. These partnerships bring together the interests of all parties in ways that are mutually beneficial, equitable, and transparent. Through them, we've been able to support relationships between organized small-scale producers and private companies, negotiating and supporting inclusive and sustainable collaboration. We know from experience that these partnerships work. Let me give you one example. In Egypt, the Agri-Food Group collaborates with farmers' associations to provide smallholder family farmers with training and high-quality seeds so they can meet strict European Union standards for potatoes. The farmers benefit from links to strong markets, and the company is able to spread its risk and meet supermarket demand by having a good supply chain. IFAD also recognizes that successful development requires getting to the root of inequalities in all its aspects, the legal aspects, the political, the socio-economic, and cultural aspects. Our gender transformative approaches aim for exactly that. Since 2009, we've been working with partners to develop what we call household methodologies to improve gender relations in the home. We started this in Uganda, getting men and women to work with a facilitator to discuss fairness, including the division of labor, and how decisions are made in the household. The results we've witnessed are transformative. Men are sharing domestic chores and childcare, women have more autonomy and can make independent purchases, including land and mobile phones. Women can buy and sell livestock and travel to markets and to sell their produce. Households have greater food security and more children are attending school. The methodology worked so well that we have now scaled it up to reach more than 75,000 households in sub-Saharan Africa, in Rwanda, Nigeria, Sierra Leone, and elsewhere. The impact of these project-based approaches reaches beyond the individual participants to change interactions and mindsets in individual communities. But we are also aware it requires a strong political agenda from governments. Ladies and gentlemen, as we consider rural inequalities, let us remember to look at the bigger picture. The world we live in is global. Its problems and solutions are not limited by geographic or political boundaries. Inequality lies at the root of so many of our problems. When you deal with poverty, you are de facto addressing inequality. When you consider migration, it must be understood that it both contributes to and is caused by inequality. As we move forward in our discussions on rural inequalities, let us also consider how to invest in a future in which all stand to benefit. Because inequality isn't just unfair as a driver of many evils, from poverty and hunger to conflict and violence, it is unsustainable. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking Oscar Garcia and Cornelia Richter for their warm welcome and also for setting out the challenges that we're facing in reducing rural inequalities. And I echo the call that Oscar made to have a provocative conference that really helps us find solutions to these challenges.